And now, Chapter 26 of The Last Boy on Earth, The Colossus of the Ruined City. Kaylee saw Grendel as Brady had originally seen him for the first time, and it was enough to cause her to lose her breath and stop the life-seeker askew on the road. Nothing she had experienced gave her such pause, caused her so much terror. If Brady had willingly walked into the hospital with only a few meager weapons to take on that monstrosity, she thought, he's the bravest person she'd ever met. The Keris that had fled from the were-dogs had rebonded to the main frame of Grendel, grafted like skin onto a wound. In that moment, her respect for Brady took on a manifold step forward. Brady. Where was he? As the general and his metal entourage met them near the river's edge, they paused to assess the situation. Brady was nowhere to be seen, and Grendel, reinvigorated, stood at the shore shouting in anger. "Where's the boy?" asked the general with concern. "I think he's in the water," Joe replied. "If my memory serves, ghosts and supernatural beings can't cross or enter running water." "Oh, like in the Legend of Sleepy Hollow and the Headless Horseman?" asked Kaylee, scanning the dark river for any sign of her friend. "Right. Ichabod Crane had to reach the bridge and cross it before the horseman caught up with him. Washington Irving didn't make that up. It's folklore," answered Hannibal Hamlin in reply. His head had been replaced on his shoulders, and in some manner unknown to any but the statues, it had reattached itself, only now it was slightly cocked to the left as though he was the victim of a stroke. "And if that's the case, as long as Brady's in the river, he's safe," said Joe. "As long as he can swim," was Kaylee's concern. She was worried that since she couldn't lay her eyes on him, he might already have drowned in the depths of the great river. "Troops, I'm not going to lie to you," the general said plainly. "The enemy stands by the banks of the river, and we linger here for no good purpose. The heat of battle is still upon us. We must gather our strength and rally once more. This creature cannot be allowed to stand and take down the last few humans on Earth." There was agreement among the metal throng as they took to the path that led down to the water. Grendel had lost control of his temper and was raging against the loss of the boy. While he railed and shouted to the darkness, the 6 metal warriors took their positions near him, the general with his sword at the ready, Victory with her torch. The loggers from the Waldo Pierce Memorial had an axe and a peavey, leaving the 3rd logger empty-handed, but, being a meaty-fisted fellow, it seemed like a foregone conclusion that Five-Fingered Mary would be his weapon of choice. That left the old statesman weaponless. But, being ever resourceful, he searched the ground near him and found a length of railroad iron on the ground. Wielding it like a hickory wood baseball bat, Hannibal Hamlin was ready to engage in battle. "If they kill the monster, they'll kill Dr. Grendel," Joe said quietly. Neither he nor Kaylee wished Dr. Grendel to perish, but they needed Brady to live. And how could they have one of them survive without the other's death? They watched as the metal squad cautiously made its way down the embankment towards the distracted beast. It seemed like a hopeless assault, knowing that they couldn't actually end this struggle tonight. The river called to her in its melodious, rhythmic song. "Joe, I've got to leave you here for a few minutes. I need to get down to the water." "The water?" he asked simply. "I have an idea," she replied. "The other were-dogs. I don't know where they went, but I have a feeling that they're lurking in the dark just beyond. Keep the doors locked and the windows closed." "Don't worry about me," he answered confidently. "I'm as tough as nails. I've been taking care of myself for a long time, and I don't plan on stopping any time soon. You do what you have to, and, Kaylee?" he asked. "Yes?" "Just be careful." "I will," she replied. The metal troop was upon Grendel before he had time to react. Hamlin's swung the railroad iron hard into the creature's back, knocking him off balance and sending him tumbling toward the water. To Grendel's relief, he didn't fall into the river, only near it. Victory thrust her torch toward the monster and sent a plume of yellow and red-tongued fire over Grendel's head and shoulders. He screamed in pain and anger, but this didn't deter him from moving forward toward the stand of fighters. The axe logger swung mightily and let the blade fall into the beast's side, but it rebounded back like he had just struck stone. Stunned, the axe logger fell backward and onto the ground, and from the recoil of his own strike. With his fists, the meat-fisted logger began hammering into the torso of Grendel, but the monster seemed to grow stronger with each hit. Grendel appeared to be getting physically larger with each attack that he successfully fended off. Kaylee found her way to the water and thrust both hands into it. The world changed, like it did in her dream. White light filled her vision, and she was no longer only on the banks of the river near the ruined city, but in some other place as well. "You've returned," she heard the musical voices sing. "Brady, I need to find Brady," she said as quickly as she could. The voices took their time in responding, finishing one musical movement before allowing themselves to utter, "He is safe. We guard him." "Can you bring him to me here on the shore?" she asked urgently. "That would mean reversing the flow of the river," they began in a minor key. "I don't care," she insisted. "He's my friend. I'm supposed to protect him. Bring him to me." She heard the voices begin to disband and whisper among themselves. She heard them say, "Does she know? Can she know?" And then, "We cannot deny her. She has answered the call. She is the conduit." She didn't know to what the voices referred, and she didn't care. A stronger tone answered her, not a bell or a cymbal, but perhaps a bass drum, deep and sonorous. Its voice rang and lingered. "Yes, as you command, so it is done." Kaylee kept her hands in the water, her mind in the bright white world where the fluid transported her, and she watched as they began to flow backward. The air took on a blue aspect. Time shifted itself into reverse, if such a thing was possible. She could see a small speck drifting towards her, getting larger in aspect as the speck became a person, and then the person became a man. She was stunned. Where was Brady? This was a grown man, very tall and muscular and singularly handsome. As the waters brought him nearly close enough to touch, their eyes met, and she couldn't believe what he was seeing. Was this possible? Could this be? No, it couldn't be. But his eyes. Did she know this man? "Hey, Kaylee," said the man in a deep tone, obviously pleased to see her. He reached his hand out to her, and she took it, rising from her knees and helping him out of the water. The second her hands left the water, she was back in the night world with the metal men and monster in battle in the distance, and holding her hand was Brady Smith, 14-year-old genius of the abandonment. "That was weird," he said. "It was like the river just brought me to you," he said in amazement. "Yeah, weird," she replied, not explaining that her own bewilderment and surprise was for another reason entirely. Had that handsome young man been an older version of Brady? "Are you okay?" she asked. "Yeah, I think so. Bit waterlogged, but I'll survive." She looked at him with serious eyes for a long moment, and then hugged him tightly, nearly pushing all the air out of his lungs. "Wow," he said, when she let go of her grip. "Don't you ever leave like that again," she implored. "Sorry, I thought it was a good idea at the time," he replied. "You're not playing at survival as the last boy on Earth anymore. We're a unit, all of us. We act like a family, and we stay together. Got it?" she demanded. He nodded in agreement. Even if he didn't agree with her, it would not do to further anger gray-eyed Athena. A shotgun blast filled the air, even causing the monstrous battle near the riverside to halt momentarily to see what had happened. "Joe," said Kaylee, grabbing Brady by the hand and running back up the slope towards the life-seeker. When they got there, they saw Joe standing outside of the motorhome, his shotgun squarely aimed at a group of weredogs that were circling ever closer to him. At his feet lay the form of Fenris, still breathing, but riddled with birdshot. The animal wasn't dead, but it was wounded, his brothers growing more nervous as the moments ticked past. "Come on, give me another target," said Joe calmly, his aged face full of vigor. Max was at his side, his lips curled in a sneer and a low growl tumbling from his throat. One of the weredogs jumped forward, lunging high. Max was ready to pounce and land his own jaws around the weredog's throat, but it was too late. Joe aimed and shot quickly and efficiently. At his feet, near the still breathing body of Fenris, it fell lifeless. "Any more?" Joe asked as he quickly reloaded his shotgun. The weredogs fell back into the night. Leaderless, they had to determine which of the remaining pack would become their new leader. Kaylee and Brady were at his side within a moment. "I told you I could take care of myself, little girl," he said, smiling. "I guess you're right," she said, pleased that Joe was in one piece. Brady was at the life seeker, and in a moment, still soaking wet from his river experience, he brought out a first aid kit from the back. "What are you doing?" asked Kaylee. "I think he's going to tend to the big were-dog," Joe replied. It never occurred to Kaylee to even give the creature another thought, but there was Brady on his knees in front of Fenris, looking over his broken body for the puncture wounds inflicted by the shotgun blast. It didn't take him long to back away in frustration. "There's too many," he said. "I can't treat them all. He's gonna die." "Well, good riddance," muttered Kaylee. "No," Brady explained. "Don't you see? This is just somebody's dog, someone's pet. He's not a bad dog, not really. It's just that Grendel was making him into something else, something he didn't want to be. In a way, he's just like Dr. Grindel." Both Kaylee and Joe understood and realized that Brady was right. Something akin to compassion even flared in Kaylee, whose heart could be steel and whose aspect could be stone. Fenris's breathing was shallow and getting weaker with each breath. From several small wounds, rivulets of blood slowly seeped into the spongy ground. Brady put his hand on the were-dog's head and began to stroke his fur. For an instant, he felt Fenris respond to and move toward his touch. "Oh, I bet he was a good dog," said Brady simply, as Max found his way to his side. Brady reassuringly began to pet him with his other hand. They remained in silence for a few moments, until a cawing was coming from the sky that broke it. Brady looked up into the darkness, but instead of the raven Hugin appearing in the blackness, a paperback book held together with an elastic band fell at his feet. It was the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. "Ben," said Brady. "Hello, my boy. Are you well?" asked Ben Franklin in his avuncular fashion. "Yes, so far so good," replied Brady, seeing the initial confusion on the faces of Joe and Kaylee. "I've formed an alliance that should stand against this monster long enough for you folks to determine how to bring it down," informed the book. "I can see that. Well done, Mr. Ambassador," Brady replied. "That's that marvelous bird. He understands everything I say. You know, when the Congress made the eagle our national bird, I protested, saying that the wild turkey was a better choice, but now I would change my vote to the raven. If I think we gave him enough time, I think he could learn how to read, write, and play chess." Everyone heard the book now. Everyone, as clear as a bell. The world had changed again. "What happened? Where'd you go? What'd you do?" asked Kaylee. "I contacted the general. I convinced him, with mere words, to simply step right off of that platform. When he knew that you were in trouble, he did a brave thing, and once he knew he could perambulate about the world, he accompanied me on my mission. We found every statue that this fine city has and awoke them. Seems they've been waiting for someone to talk to them as well. How fares the battle?" Brady looked up and watched as the monster seemed to be growing larger and larger as the statues continued their onslaught. Because they were not made of flesh and bone, they could take a hit and arise to continue their assault. Still, even though they may be mighty, they did not seem to be weakening or slowing Grendel. "Not well, I'm afraid," Brady answered. "Well, then I dare say it's time for some reinforcements," answered Ben Franklin, with not a small amount of satisfaction seething from his voice. The general watched with a look of grave concern on his face. He glanced at Victory, who looked down to the ground in worry. "I am concerned about the outcome of this event," stated the general simply. "Don't worry, something's coming to help us," Brady said, smiling. "Something big." They felt the approach of their new ally before they saw it. It rumbled through the ground, sending seismic shocks through their feet. Whatever it was huge. The moon cast down enough silver light upon the landscape to give a hint of what was coming. There in the distance, a slight image formed. Closer and closer it tromped until they could all clearly see Brady's handiwork. "No way," said a stunned Kaylee, her eyes nearly popping from their sockets. "I don't believe it," said Joe, thunderstruck at the size of the approaching colossus. "You didn't," the general said to Brady. "Well, he's the only one big enough to get the job done," answered Brady in smug self-satisfaction. He had summoned this behemoth as surely as he had summoned forth Grendel. The city of Bangor had a few claims to notoriety throughout its history. Among other things, it was once the lumber capital of the entire world, shipping out more wood from its riverside warehouses than any other city. In fact, the lumber that shipped from this place helped build cities all over the planet, especially eastern seaboard cities and those in Europe. It was pride in that accomplishment that led the city fathers to erect a monument to their city's past glory along Main Street in front of the Cross Center. A monument to the era in which it was built. It was oversized, optimistic, and garish. It was the largest of its kind in the world, and it stood on a stone pedestal, a long threaded iron rod connecting its head to the rest of its body. Some might claim him from Minnesota or Wisconsin, even Oregon, but Bangor had him first. There, clearly approaching them from the burned and ruined city of Bangor, was the giant statue of Paul Bunyan, striding as a colossus through the world. He strode toward them, over 30 feet tall and weighing almost 4,000 pounds. In one hand he carried a giant peavey, and on his shoulder rested a gigantic axe. He was the tallest statue of Paul Bunyan on earth. With green wool pants, a red and black checkered wool coat, and a red toque on his head, he sported an enormous and somewhat idiotic smile frozen onto his red-cheeked face. He strode in mightily, with sweeping steps making his way to them, the raven Hugin settling proudly on the giant's axe head. He stopped in front of Brady and waited. I think he's waiting for you to tell him what to do," Joe insisted to Brady. "He's big and good-hearted, but he's not the sharpest tool in the shed, I bet." Brady nodded, his mouth still agape from the sheer bulk of the creature towering over them. Mr. Bunyan, sir?" The grinning colossus looked down at the small group and said nothing. "Mind of a child, Brady, mind of a child. You're going to have to give him some very specific, simple instructions. Speak slowly and use small words," said Joe. "Paul, do you see those people fighting over there?" The giant turned to the direction in which Brady pointed. When he saw the fighting, he smiled and nodded affirmatively, his tiny mind requiring Brady to speak so slowly and use small words. "Well, the little meadow people are trying to stop the big white glowing monster from getting to us. You've got to help us. You've got to get to them," Brady slowly explained. "Do you understand?" Paul Bunyan nodded, his grin beginning to disturb all of them, especially Kaylee, who found she couldn't look at the face for long before averting her gaze. "Okay, good. What I want you to do is go over there and grab hold of the monster with your strong arms. Just hold on to him so he can't move, okay?" The giant nodded and turned his body toward the fight by the riverbank, treading down the hill in only a few steps. They watched with rapt attention at the reaction of the combatants as this Goliath suddenly entered their midst. The general understood immediately that this was his turning point, and he ordered his soldiers to fall back and get out of Bunyan's way as he moved into the fray and closed in upon Grendel. For his part, Grendel saw the huge statue and did something truly unexpected. Brady's breath escaped him as he saw the monster double in size within seconds, expanding like a supernova in front of them. It was obvious that Grendel was using all of his strength, expending the keres within him to enable him to respond to this new gargantuan threat. With mighty arms, the giants began to battle. "All we need now is a giant gorilla and a flying robot," Kaylee said. "I hope this works," Joe replied. "It will," Brady added. The two behemoths wrestled and fought hand to hand, shaking the ground. Paul Bunyan swung his axe, but it seemed to have little effect against Grendel. Lightning could be seen in the distance as Grendel summoned every fell power to his aid. Thunder rolled closer and closer. Grendel countered every move that Paul Bunyan could throw at him, and it quickly became clear that Grendel was the more cunning of the two combatants, because every time he was caught in the grip of Bunyan's mighty fiberglass and steel hands, he simply changed form slightly and slipped away. A wraith, a greased pig, a wisp. The earth shook and the water rippled until it became obvious that this was a stalemate. There was no clear winner. Even though Grendel was smarter, Bunyan was stronger. "We can't just stand here," Kaylee said. "Well, what can we do?" asked Joe. "He's afraid of the water. It burns him like fire," Brady answered. "When I went in, he wouldn't follow me." "You mean you want the lumberjack to throw him into the river?" asked Kaylee. "If you do that, you risk Dr. Grindel's life. He might not be strong enough to survive such a shock," Joe reminded them. "Tell him to take the chance," said Ben Franklin to Brady. "I don't think the water will kill Grendel, but it might get him to abandon the body of Dr. Grindel, don't you think?" asked Brady. "I don't know. I say we do it," said Joe. Said Franklin, "We all need to hang together, or we shall indeed hang separately." Kaylee wondered slightly if she might not be of some assistance in this plan, for she had used the waters to bring Brady back to her. Perhaps she could use them to save the good doctor from drowning. Besides, since they had made their way to the riverbank, she couldn't get the sound of singing from ringing in her ears. It was like the water was summoning her, seeking her for company, as though it needed her. "Do it," she said firmly. "If that fiberglass skyscraper can manage to throw Grendel into the river, this is a no-brainer. Do it." Brady put his two pinkies into the side of his mouth and whistled a loud, sharp report to the wind. Within a minute, Hugin was on his shoulder. "Tell Paul Bunyan to throw Grendel into the river as far as he can." "Ragnarok," crowed the raven as he took to the air, pumping his black silken wings. He made his way to the fighting giants and wove a circle in the air around Paul Bunyan, cawing and screeching his pleas. The giant was slow to notice and even more slow to respond, but he eventually changed his tactics according to Hugin's order, no longer seeking to restrain Grendel. Instead, he picked up the beast, and with Herculean effort, he threw him far out into the main stream of the great river Penobscot. What happened in the next moment burned itself into the minds of all who witnessed it upon that fateful night. Long years would pass before anything as violent and climactic had ever happened again in this quiet, forested part of the world. However, on this night, with the moon now directly overhead and the stars waltzing slowly around the world, the form of Grendel hit the surface of the water with an explosion that knocked all the onlookers flat on the ground, a shock wave blasting like a tsunami, pounding anything in its path. A mushroom spout arose from the water, and Kaylee, who was now down by the shore, saw the river shrink back from its banks as the fountain of water thrown into the air continued to rise. Within the spout of water was the glowing form of Grendel, personified anger and hatred of all humankind, struggling like a panic-driven, drowning man. Sparks and electrical tongues of static shot out from the water and upwards to the sky as Grendel began his death throes. Except he wasn't drowning. He was being shredded, burned, flayed, and ripped, all at the same time. The water churned and bubbled, boiled and rolled. Kaylee alone knew that there were beings in the water, those of the waters, and she dove into the water and allowed her entire body to go beneath the waves. Submerging, she entered the ghost world again. She was surrounded by music, and she wasn't swimming but flying through what seemed to be air. She was surrounded by forms in the water, female forms that swam next to her and around her, and with unseen hands held her up and propelled her along. Were these the bodies whose voices she had spoken with before? How strange, she thought, how real this feels, how familiar. Were these Nereids? What were Nereids doing in the Penobscot River? Except this wasn't the Penobscot River at all. It was another kind of river entirely. "She has returned," she heard an indistinct voice sing. "Welcome, welcome, welcome," 1,000 voices chimed. She didn't know how to respond. All she wanted was to find Dr. Grindle. If the plan went... One more time. Okay, here we go. If the plan went as she hoped, Grendel would abandon his body to the waters as he desperately tried to escape, and she was bound and determined not to let the doctor drown. She understood now. He had not been the one hunting her. He was a victim as much as she was. "What's happening?" she asked aloud. Voices answered. "The inhuman anthropomorph is shredding its host. Ancient treaties are being honored. What is your bidding? What do you wish?" "There's a man within that monster, held against his will. Find him, bring him to me alive," she ordered, suddenly feeling foolish for speaking in the imperative. Still, somehow, it felt natural, and the voices responded favorably. One more time. God. Still, somehow, it felt natural, and the voices responded favorably. "Yes, yes, yes," was being whispered and sung as she found herself lifted to the surface of the water and guided toward the shore. And for a moment, Kaylee saw something that none of the others would ever see, for she saw it while between the worlds, while in the water. She watched as the light of the waters, as Grendel What the heck? One more time. She watched in the light of the waters as Grendel writhed and moaned. He was different in this world, as everything seemed different. Instead of a large and monstrous excuse for a human, he was smaller, more vulnerable. As every second ticked by, if time even existed here, she watched him diminish into what he must have been before the abandonment and the great dying. She saw into the heart of things, and there, nearly empty, was a boy who looked a little like Brady. She could hear it calling, "Not now, so close, nearly finished. Leave me be, get thee hence, be gone. I am meant to cleanse this world. No!" And she watched it as it rose from the river. Those of the waters had erased all but a mote of what had been Grendel. He diminished and grew ever smaller. She observed with more than human sight as the mote arose from the waters and floated into the sky, like some drunken bumblebee, like Tinkerbell in the land of lost boys. She followed it as it rose over the riverbank and up toward her friends and the life-seeker. It dove down amongst them and was no longer visible to her. The voices continued and spoke to her, saying, "We have him. We are moving him to you. Does this please you?" Kaylee answered, "Yes, very much. Thank you." "She thanks us. She is the one." 100 other echoes of similar import came to her as she saw the form floating toward her on the water. She recognized him. Floating towards her, looking like a dead man, was the inert and sodden form of Dr. Grindle. Invisible hands guided his body toward her and handed him off with silent respect. She could feel that he was nearly spent of life, but she knew he was alive. How do I know this? How long has he been a tool of the thing so full of spite and malice? The monster had detached himself from the doctor at last, leaving little more than an empty husk. As she arose from the waters, the dark night of the world returned again, but this time Brady was there, helping her tug the body from the water. He knelt down and checked for a pulse, his finger pressed firmly against the doctor's carotid artery. Weak, but there was definitely a pulse. He put his head down to hear if the man was breathing. He was. Brady brought a blanket from the life-seeker and covered Dr. Grindle, and only then, after he was fairly certain that they were out of danger, did he stop and marvel at Kaylee. "You're amazing," he declared. "How did you do that?" "Do what?" she feigned, smiling nervously. What none of them noticed was that the small dot of light that was still Grendel floated purposefully through the night air, over to the side of the life-seeker. Since all assembled were looking down at the river and the great commotion that was playing itself out, they didn't see the nearly dead form of Fenris begin to quiver as the small speck of hatred, envy, and pain entered the were-dog's body through one of his open, seeping wounds. They didn't see the human hand begin to shake, quiver, and move once more. Like a virus, Grendel infected. This creature he entered now would have to do, even if the only human part of Fenris was its hand. He could survive in this body even if he couldn't thrive. He could hold on, and if he was able, further stab at those humans who remained, at some other time and some other place. The hand of Fenris obeyed its master, and very quietly, while no one noticed, it pulled at the ground, grasping at whatever it could to pull itself away and into the cover of darkness. As it did, if one could have peered at the damage done to the animal by Joe's shotgun, one would have watched as holes ripped open by lead shot began to push out the round pellets and close of their own volition. With every passing moment, Fenris began to heal, as with each passing moment, the inexorable force known as Grendel began to take hold of his newest host. End of chapter.